But so I think the first half of the story is going to be kind of a personal interpretation of Tatar history of the past 1,000 years. Don't worry, it's not going to be a half-hour introduction of 1,000 years. But I do think that what happens in the 19th century really helps inform our understanding of various kinds of movements and the various kinds of conflicts that you have in the be it among the Muslims of the Russian Empire in their Dumas, or the different kinds of ideas for identity among different groups of Muslim Turks in the Russian Empire at different moments. So, of course, I am not a specialist on Japan. I haven't even visited Japan, but I actually did visit Hokkaido by Zoom for a talk of last month. And so, of course, there are bona fide specialists on Tatars in Japan. I mean, Larissa is with us, Ali Bey is with us, and Nadir Devlet is from the Tatar community in Manchuria, and he's in Istanbul. So that's somebody that might be of interest for you as well. Since he grew up in that, it was my mother's side, my family grew up there. And so what I'd like to do is just bring a few strands from some of my interest in the history of Turkic languages and cultures, and the interdisciplinary medieval history of Turkic peoples, and also some of my interest in the intellectual history of Tatars and Turks in the 19th and 20th centuries. So if we're going back 1,000 years, and I'm a medievalist, but I'm not going to impose that on you by force. And I see, okay, my internet is back again. So basically, we can talk about the establishment of Volga Bulgaria at the confluence of the Volga and Kama rivers. I'll show that on a map in a moment. When Ahmed ibn Fadlan visited there in the around 922, the Volga Bulgarians had recently arrived. They were kind of semi-nomadic, partially sedentarizing. They had a fortified town there, if it's the one that I visited. And so the period of their real affluence was in the 13th and 14th centuries, during the time of the Golden Horde. And it's hotly contested in the 19th century, or even today, thanks to maybe prompting from the FSB or other groups. So some Tatars today still hang on to this notion of a Bulgar identity. And one of the issues with that is that the Bulgars were Muslims, but their language is related to Chuvash, which is not mutually intelligible with Tatar of today. So, okay, so I need to, okay, so I always feel naked without a map. So one of the points that I'd like to make is that before the establishment of the Golden Horde, or the Ulus of Juti, which was roughly like from around over here all the way to Eastern Europe, you had the small state in Volga, Bulgaria. And so this was the Golden Horde itself was a rather large state. I'm a specialist on that. I am not going to go into that in detail because that would be another hour. So one of the things that I argue is that with the bubonic plague in the 14th century and later, so the Black Death, or in Turkish Veba or Taun, what we see is that this huge territory becomes rather depopulated. There are various theories. There are some ideas about why this region became very heavily depopulated. And in other talks I give relating to the history of pandemics in this part of the world, one of the things that I mentioned in passing is that there was an article in 2016 that said that the one example of the bacterium for Yersinia pestis, which was found in Bulgar, is actually the ancestor of all of the various strains that later come after 1347 via Constantinople to the Mediterranean and Europe. So it was an important part of the story, but that's not the story that I'm going to tell today. But what I would say is that the states that come into being in the 1430s and 1440s, like Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of the Crimea, the Khanate of Astrakhan, the Kasimov Khanate, and the Siberian Khanate, are much, much smaller. And so part of the story, I think, is that because of depopulation, most of the Bulgarian population is wiped out, and whoever wasn't wiped out was later wiped out by Tamerlane. I actually am not sure that it was Tamerlane who destroyed them. I think it was plague. But so there's a huge ethnic transformation in the West. And so you have Tatars localized in around Kazan, which is about 100 kilometers north of the city of Bulgar. You have various populations to the east, but the Tatars are also one of those communities like Armenians and Jews, and from India, the Indians, Multanis, in Central Asia, who form diaspora communities because of their commercial interest. And that's going to be one of the threads of some of the things that I want to say. So since I'm hopping and skipping and jumping through Tatar history, I'll have a few slides. So the first point that I made is I really think that the population we have that's Kipchak speaking from the 1430s on is smaller in size. It loses strength uh, in comparison to Moscow because the pandemic has helped the Muscovite Grand Duke gather the Russian lands, since there the system of government was not based upon tribal organization the way it was in the Golden Horde or the Khanates of Kazan and Crimea, but it was based upon estates. And so in the case of the Khanate of Kazan, the state was characterized by having four Karachibeys who were the leaders of four separate tribes. And at the beginning, these were the Shirin, the Baran, the Argun, and the Kupchak. And so just even the names of the tribes suggest a large-scale movement of tribes from Eastern territories, because earlier in the 13th and 14th centuries, as far as I can reconstruct, the main tribes of the western part of the Golden Horde, or the Akwarda, were the Kongrat, Kiyat, Mangut, and Seljuk. So it's because of this non-nationalistic the tribes had their own interests. The Khan was not an autocrat, and the various beys, especially the leader of the Shirin Bey tribe, would negotiate with the Shibanids, would negotiate with the Grand Duke, and this led to the demise of the Khanate. What we can say about the civilization there is, of course, it's already an Islamic Turkic civilization. It's very deeply religious already in the 14th century under Uzbek Khan, in the middle of the 14th century. There was an earlier literature in the Golden Horde. After the Black Death, there was a hiatus of about 6 decades. When you get to the Khanate of Kazan, it has some surviving elements of its literature and of its diplomatic correspondence. You have the Yasawi Sufi tariqat there, and so on. And so, in part because of the disappearance of the Bulgar population and the influx of Nogais and all kinds of others, you have the Kipchakization of this territory. And if in the middle of the 13th to the middle of the 14th century in this region, you have inscriptions in a language which is very, very close to the ancestor of Chuvash, what you get later on are tombstones written in Old Tatar. And so post-conquest, after 1552 and 1556 in Astrakhan, so you have some of the Tatar nobility joining Muscovy as service princes. Some may be exiled or killed. Some ran away. You had population exiled from the town center of Kazan. In the 16th and 18th century, you had forced Christianization, and Agnes Kefeli Clay has written about the Krashin Tatars, which is the name for the Christianized group. There are records describing agriculture in the Kazan province. And so already we can say that from the late 15th century, the rewriting of chronicles, the ideologically based rewriting of chronicles in the Russian states, done by Russian church officials, laid the ideological basis for the conquest in 1552, and that has also informed. So the negative stereotypes in that have informed, let's say, the views in Russian national history concerning, let's say, the Mongols and Tatars, which they collapsed together. There's also the work written after the conquest, the Kazanskaya Historia. It's not Tatarskaya Historia, it's Kazanskaya Historia, which is the first time where you have even the use of the term Golden Horde or like Zlataya Arda. And so already when that occurs, it's kind of a bundle of negative characteristic features. So one of the questions that I've wondered about, that I've discussed with students over time, is from what point in time do we begin to see relations, or how do relations continue between the Middle Volga region and Central Asia? From what time on do we see the beginning of the missionary activity of the Naqshbandiya order? And I think the answer is probably pretty soon following the conquest, because I have very little basis for seeing evidence of disruption in trade, disruption in cultural contacts that had already been going on for 500 years earlier. Okay, so I'm making some assumptions here, but I think it makes it easier to contextualize and easier to to tell a story. In the 16th to 18th centuries, that's a period of climatic downturn, and that's known as the Little Ice Age. It's connected with reduced solar sunspot activity. This was a time in the 1600s or middle of the 16th century when the Thames River would freeze, when the Bosphorus or Boğaz in Istanbul would freeze. If you read Evliya Çelebi crossing the Straits of Kerch, the armies of the Crimean Han are crossing the Straits of Kerch over the ice. I don't know if it freezes now. That's a whole other research question. But so we see that there's a time of tremendous climatic downturn in the entire world. Okay, so what this must have meant for the population of the Middle Volga region, just like for the Ottoman Empire, but even more so, it would have meant that there were some times of failed harvests and probably famine. At some point, they were growing rye, but when you have rye harvests failing, or because you don't have enough sunshine, enough heat, you have too much rain, because the winter is coming early, it creates a fungal poisoning of the rye. And so one of the, this is called St. Anthony's fire, or it has there's other names for it as well. But this kind of poisoning has been studied for different parts of the world, and actually, a book that talks about that, Poisons of the Past, points out that the territory of the Tatar ASSR was that point in the world where you had the worst instances of rye poisoning, and so that can lead to psychosis, that can lead to circulatory problems, limbs falling off. And so I have this little theory in my mind whether this kind of melancholy quality or mung in Tatar culture, whether it comes back to some of these kinds of issues. But I can never prove that, so I won't dwell on it. And so in speaking with my colleague Iskender Gilyazov in Kazan, since I'm not a specialist in archives of any kind, let alone 17th century archives for the Kazan Uyez, I asked him, so what is the most common food in the 17th century in the Middle Volga region? He said millet. So when you think about it, the climate changed so much that even the basic grains that they were using changed to something that was more that was able to grow in these harsh climates. And so one of the questions I might ask is, okay, so in this period, just as with after 1552, did we have the same level of trade as we might have had in the 14th century, or we might have had in the 11th or 12th century? But just one little tiny factoid. We know very little about the horse trade between let's say, the Volga region and India. But Ibn Battuta in the 1330s does say in passing that, oh yeah, they're exporting horses to India. So clearly there's a huge amount of trade from earlier periods that's not written out in detail. And so I would assume that a lot of the trade is continuing. And when we think about some of the basic dishes that are associated with like ritual celebrations in Tatar culture, in Tatar food culture, I would argue that some of these look like they are connected to Central Asian cuisines because they're using rice, they're using dried fruits and things like that. Uh, and so I'm just beginning to wonder, or I've been thinking about it for some time. Is it that the food culture, especially that connected with ritual Islamic celebrations, is it food that, let's say, the teachers who had studied in Bukhara or Samarkand had brought with them or were involved in trading for? So there's all kinds of things like that that one doesn't read about. And so how did the commercial, cultural, religious ties with Central Asia change because of climatic downturn? What were they like before, and what were they like after? So I promised that I wouldn't spend a half hour leading up to the 19th century. So I should say, so when we're thinking about the 1700s and the early 1800s, there's a few general statements that I would like to make. One is that, and this is a fundamental point for the debate over Tatar identity. So we have these so-called Bulgarian histories that claim that are basically written in support of an Islamic past. But I've argued that they're inventing linkages with the past. If they're making up things even in the early 19th century and getting dates wrong, where they're mentioning Nadir Shah or other things, and they're talking about how they were, the people at the time of the Prophet Muhammad were involved with the Volga region. These are probably totally invented, and it kind of shows a discontinuity with the past. But still, you have many people today who are saying, "I'm not a Tatar, I'm a Bulgar," or something like that, because of the ancient Volga Bulgarian state. Another thing is that it's very clear that in the Middle Volga region, and elsewhere in the Russian Empire, that Muslim identity, Muslim practice is still going very, very strong, such that the state wants to organize some of that, in part to regulate it, in part to control it. And so that results in 1788 in the establishment of the Orenburg Muslim Spiritual Assembly, which later moves to Ufa. We know that traditional village mekteb education was going strong, and that people in the 18th century, late 18th century, in terms of people we know about, are traveling to receive a madrasa education in Bukhara or Samarkand. Some may go as far as Balkh in Afghanistan. And when they return after a period of 5 to 10 years of education or more, they will be the village imam, and that will be their career. And they will marry a pious woman, and she will be an instructor for the girl students, and they'll have a school next to the mosque, etc. And so this is one of those things that kept the core of Muslim Turkic culture and civilization going in the Middle Volga region up until around 1800. That what I can't answer, and I've looked around, I haven't found any answers, is so okay. So in 1750, were people traveling to Bukhara and Samarkand? In 1700, were they? When did they start? I'm really curious about that, just out of intellectual curiosity. And when I look at some of the standard histories, including the 7-volume history of the Tatars and Tatarstan that was produced not too long ago, and I have some articles in there too on medieval topics, uh, I don't really have a good picture, a good set of answers to these questions. Now, there's some other interesting research by that is beginning to make me ask some new questions. So, for example, Scott Levi, his latest book, which came out in 2020, is about the crisis in Bukhara in the 17th century. And he has written a work where he's talking about connected histories, how Bukhara is connected to the Qing Empire, it's connected to Russia, it's connected to Iran, it's connected to Siberia. And so, he's arguing that, for example, because of the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689 and the Treaty of Kyakhta in 1727, that resulted in a huge increase in trade between Russia and China, including participation by Bukharan merchants who are going to Tobolsk. You have those who reside in Tobolsk. You have those who spend time in Tobolsk but go back. And so a lot of these were also going to the market at Lake Yamush in northeastern Kazakhstan. And so I suspect that among a lot of these traders, you may have had people from the Volga, Middle Volga region coming to Bukhara and then going on trade, or at least at a minimum trading in Bukhara with people who were going further to the east. And so I think one of the things that we see from this time on is the beginning of, or the rise in, a merchant diaspora among Tatars. And so this is also something that I have a little bit of a personal interest in, and I'll get to that later. So I think clearly something happens from around 1800 to 1917, and so people sometimes refer to that as the Tatar Renaissance of the 19th and the early 20th centuries. And this definitely does have it does have a tremendous impact upon a discussion of identity. So sometimes I think about the big picture, and I like to ask myself, why is it that this happened? And so I think one of the things that occurs to me is that with the end of the Little Ice Age, did you suddenly have a resulting agricultural surplus? Did you have an increase in wealth in the villages, just like in Soviet times with the kolkhozes being kind of well off compared to the urban centers? Did especially if we can say that beginning in like the 1780s, 1790s, people started going to Bukhara and Samarkand, and they weren't going before, that could be a result of increased wealth. And we should also consider that by 1800, almost 250 years after the conquest of Kazan in 1552, Tatars had been under post-colonial rule for almost 250 years. So I think we have to think of a Muslim society, a Muslim Turkic society that had been under post-colonial rule for that period in time. The societies, I think the Tatar or Turkic Muslim society and the Russian society was not intermingling very much, but there was some intermingling. And what is the result of that? That's a question that I would like to pose. And so again, but we know by 1800 that Tatar students are going to Bukhara and Samarkand. Do we know how long they've been going there? Another interesting fact, this is maybe not critical to what I'm discussing today, but another thing about this period is that from I think exactly 1800 on, you have the beginning of the publication of books in Tatar and Arabic script, and in other variants of Turkic in the Russian Empire. So this is in contrast to the Ottoman Empire, of course, where printing, like with Ibrahim Mutaferrika and so on, and then later you have a hiatus. So you have a population which has a rather high, compared to the rest of Russian society, rate of literacy, and not just in Tatar and Arabic. I mean, in Tatar, but also in Arabic. So, for example, there's the Darul Kutub website run by the Muftiyat in Kazan, and they have over 1,000 books now scanned. Most of them are, or almost all of them, like pre-1917. And so, it's just really remarkable how many books were printed, how many of them were not in Turkic, but let's say in Arabic. I'm really not sure how many of them might have been in Persian, of any. So this contributes to a great, I think, a great high level of cultural awareness, indeed a kind of civilization. And the last point on this slide is, so you see in the 19th century developments associated with modernity, but what is the pathway? Is it that people are learning modern ideas like the separation of the religious sphere from the public sphere from Russian sources? Are they learning it from the Ottoman Empire? Later on, you have people who go and study in Paris even. But so I'm not sure what the path for this is, though I have some ideas. Now, so I'd like to hop and skip through a series of individuals to talk about, where the trajectory. And so, like, one of the persons you can talk about is Abdurrahman Utuzimani al-Bulghari, who died in 1834. And so this is somebody who was very much in favor of Sharia and in favor of taqlid, of following the guidance of earlier scholars. And so if you don't, that's really very, very bad. In contrast to that, he also stressed the importance of education and the tragic fate of those who go to Bukhara to study, because they're going to become victims of the mullahs. So this is in part, I saw that Dilara Usmanova joined the talk. And so her father, Mir Qasim Usmanov, had written a series of wonderful essays about figures in the 19th century, and he's one of those who tried to stress the progressive side of Utazimani. But I would say that Soviet scholarship had maybe certain limitations in terms of what they could and could not say. And so when all of these scholars of the 19th and early 20th century are painted with the broad brush of reformer or progressive enlightener or prosvetitel, it totally hides the differences between them. Another very, very famous individual was Abu Nasr Qursawi, who basically, one of the things he was for the importance of ijtihad, or personal interpretation of the Quran, important not just for religious scholars, but for incumbent upon everybody. But so even though the Jadid, the modernist scholars and intellectuals of the late 19th and early 20th century, even though they portrayed Qursawi as one of their own, he really was not a modern scholar. He was using classical Islamic methods to argue for the use of ijtihad. So utilizing the hermeneutical framework of usul al-fiqh, according to Nathan Spanos. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't the hero and adopted as an icon by later scholars. Now, one interesting figure is Kayun Nasiri, and some people actually call him the father of the Tatar nation. But this is somebody who was not arguing for a political ideology or a national history. He was somebody who was writing about ethnography, wrote a grammar, did an annual publication, tried to collect folklore, tried to elevate Kazan Tatar or Tatar of his time to the status of a literary language. And in that case, from that point of view, he would be more like fitting in phase A of Miroslav Hrok's typology, where activists try to lay the foundation for a national identity, but they're not really making national demands. And so for me, a scholar that I've worked on I began to be interested in him in the 1980s, is Shihabuddin Marjani. And so he advocated reform in education. He was teaching at the Russo-Tatar school, Tatar teacher school, and he was in contact with European scholars who were residing in Kazan and working in Kazan, including Wilhelm Radloff. And so I think maybe one of the points of transmission for ideas about modernity and what a European-style education might be were through him. So Marjani was considered to be a great Arabist. His works are still reprinted in Arabic-speaking countries, and he was considered to be the greatest scholar of Islamic civilization in the Russian Empire in the 19th century. But I think in addition to other things he's done relating to religion, relating to Islamic civilization, he wrote a 2-volume work in Tatar, Mustafadul Akhbar fi Ahwal Kazan wa Bulgar, which I have argued is a national history. And so national history. And so I think he laid the theoretical groundwork for Tatars believing that they should be calling themselves Tatars, that they should be affiliated to that territory, that their history is in a direct line from Volga, Bulgaria to the Golden Horde, to the Khanate of Kazan, and to the Muslim Tatars of the Middle Volga region. So I think that's a critical moment in the history of the identity of Turkic peoples, which is still not fully appreciated, namely that Tatars already had a territorialized identity after the publication of the first volume of his work in the 1880s. The second volume is more like a prosopography of scholars that was published after his death in the 1890s. And especially after 1905, his project for a Tatar nation really took off in the press. Just to contrast, this is to contrast with another great figure in the history of the Muslim Turks of the Russian Empire, Ismail Gaspinski, who studied in Paris too. And so for him, Russian Muslims can be good citizens. So that's one ideological thing. He established the newspaper Terjuman Pirivodchik beginning in 1883. And from 1905 on, the masthead said Dilde Fikirde İşte Birlik, so unity in language, thought, and deed. He also advocated a new phonetic method for teaching the Arabic alphabet, which promised success in 40 days. He also opened new method schools. So beginning in now I don't remember, the 1880s. And so at first it was or two that he did with great difficulty. But then by the time at the end of his life, it was like 10,000 Reform modernist schools. So that was really a remarkable thing. So what I'd like to turn to now, and I hope I've left myself enough time, maybe I'm a liar about how much I'm going to talk about history, so that's my professional defect, is a series of trans-regional actors. And I'm not going to spend much time on this, I hope, but what I'd like to do is say, so because we have these merchant diasporas, because we have these far-flung connections or points where you have Tatar diasporas living, there actually was, because of modernity, because of the modern post, because of railways, steamship, telegrams, and so on, you had communications between them. And so this is not my field. I've had students who've worked on some of these things, but as a historian, I enjoy thinking about this and thinking out loud. So I'm not sure that I'm doing this in the right order, but let's just go for it. So one of my students who's in Istanbul now, Abdul Said Aykut, did an amazing dissertation on Murat Ramzi. And so Murat Ramzi is almost an unknown figure, or was almost an unknown figure. But so he had translated the Kashifi Rashahat Ain al-Hayat, which is a really fundamentally important biographical work of Naqshbandi masters. He translated the Maktubat of Sirhindi from Persian into Arabic, and in my understanding, many people thought the Arabic is the original. He wrote this amazing, huge one-volume work in Arabic, which was really a national anti-colonial history. Talfiq al-Akhbar wa Talqiq al-Athar fi Waqa'i Kazan wa Bulgar wa Muluk al-Tatar. So on the events in Kazan and Bulgar and the Tatar rulers. And so his work was banned by the Tsarist authorities. Later on, he was living in Mecca as a Naqshbandi sheikh. There was a small Tatar community there too. And his students were the founders of the modern Naqshbandi movement in Indonesia. And so not only was he an anti-colonial scholar, he ends up moving at the end of his life, moving to Sharqi Turkestan, to Eastern Turkestan, I don't know if he was engaged in any kind of resistance, but I just kind of wonder about that. And that's a photo of him with his children. So just in terms of the impact of one person, that he has done amazing work as a translation. In Mecca, he was probably, one of the points of the Hajj is that it's an annual forum for the exchange of ideas, and part of that can be ideas about the nation, ideas about anti-colonial resistance. And the other thing is, like, why did he write that work in Arabic? And maybe because he was writing for the ulama, not for the lay people. So that's a very interesting point. Now, another person that we can mention here is Ayaz Izhaki, who, if it were not for the fact that he was suppressed in Soviet times, that people didn't know about him or didn't dare talk about him until beginning in the end of the 1980s, we might be talking about him in all schools in the Turkic world as one of the great Turkic writers, dramatists, and novelists. So this is somebody who already became involved with socialist ideas in the first decade. He participated in All Muslim Congress. And so this is somebody who was very much originally a socialist, but then moved in the direction of Tatar nationalism. You may know that there was a very short-lived Idil Ural Republic. And so after that, a lot of people started calling themselves Idil Ural Tatars. He was forced to emigrate in 1920 to Germany. There he published a Tatar language journal called Milli Yul, or Yanga Milli Yul later on. Oh, it went ahead by itself. Now, so as you can tell, we're finally getting to East Asia. So what we see is that you have other individuals from let's say, call them Idil Ural, Muslim Turks or Tatars, because of the influence of Gaspinski. Some people started calling themselves Bulgar Turks or Kazan Turks, etc. But so what I'd like to just briefly flesh out or frame is that by this time, by 19 1905, by 1917, by 1920, let's say by 1920, you have some people who still cling to a pre-modern identity. So for them, the religious identity, which is not territorialized, is all that matters. Okay? You have some people, and this is a tribute to the influence of Ismail Gaspinski, who have the notion that they're Muslim Turks, that they have an identity, but it's not a territorialized identity, and that what they have is they have a milli muhtariyat. They have this national cultural autonomy across the Russian Empire, so that it's like an estate. And in addition, you have the Tatars who follow the views of Shihabuddin Merjani and his followers like Rizaeddin Fakhruddin and others, who have a very strong concept of a compartmentalized, territorialized Tatar national homeland. And what happens there is you can see it playing itself out in the various congresses, Muslim congresses, where the Tatars and the Turkestanis or the others, they just can't agree because, shall our identity be territorialized or non-territorialized? And so the Tatars want a territorial identity, the others want a non-territorialized identity. So maybe in the case of Kazakhstan, we can say the Alashorda people have a certain specific identity, and those in favor of Turkestan, led by Mustafa Shokai, they don't have a territorialized identity. So Abdulhay Kurbangali was a Bashkir who had problems back in Russia, and he later in 1924 ends up coming to Japan, and Professor Dündar has written about him and the activities of the Muslims in Japan. So Kurbangali begins to unite the emigre Tatars and Muslims across Japan. They were scattered in several places like Kobe and Kyoto and so on. And so we can say that he's more religiously inclined, that he opens the Matba'a Islamiyya, and they're publishing religious books and textbooks. And from what I can see, I don't think they're publishing like history textbooks or nationalistic material, but they are also publishing Japanese propaganda materials. And I don't know if that was voluntary or it was requested of them or so on. And it seems that he also supported the Japanese political idea of the time of the Greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. So I read that so Ayaz Izhaki who was in Germany, no doubt in touch with Zeki Velidi Togan and all kinds of other people who would later be in Germany and Poland between the two wars. But this is so. There's the meeting that they organized, and so excuse me, I don't know Japanese, but is that the Tokyo, and Izumibashi, is that the neighborhood, but the club? So, but that was the I guess the Tatar Muslim club, and somebody can correct me later. It was raided by Kurbangali and supporters, and Izhaki was beaten. So after this, the relations are broken, and so it goes along ideological lines. First of all, I think already Kurbangali was not like an Idil Ural or a Tatar nationalist. He would have been rather religiously oriented. And of course, if he was thinking of himself as a Bashkir, he may have not felt included in that political alliance. And at the same time, he had a relationship with the Japanese government in terms of being sympathetic to the Greater Asia ideology. And so he was kicked out of Japan, and he went to Dairen in Manchuria, and he was replaced by the Turk Abdul Rashid Ibrahim as religious leader of the mosque, and Ayaz Izhaki politically. But I don't know enough about the details there to talk about that in detail at this moment. So let me just give one example of a little bit of what I mean, and I'm going to try to finish up in 10 minutes, within 10 minutes, if that's okay. I'm sure my hosts don't want me to speak another half hour. But so, for example, so this is an example of one work, the Tokyo Mevlut Nebi, or the Maulid, or poem in honor of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. I'm interested in the Maulid tradition because I work on the plague in medieval times. I see this work by Süleyman Çelebi in the early 15th century and certain other works in the 14th century and later as works signifying increased religiosity. But the text takes on its own history. So among Tatars, I think under Naqshbandi influence, the Maulid tradition becomes one of the cornerstones of Tatar religious belief. I was born in 1958 in New York. I grew up going annually to the Maulid celebrations and reading these poems. And so it was originally Süleyman Çelebi's Vesiletün Necat that launched this wildly popular tradition. But the Halimcan Barudi did his version, I think, including some riffs on Süleyman Çelebi. And so this one that was done in Kyoto is either reproducing or drawing heavily upon the edition by Barudi. And so this was exactly Basıp Taratucusu, Tokyo'da Matbaa-i İslamiye, so that's from 1931. And so it explains at the beginning that this is a text that's important for the scattered Muslims of the Volga region. Now, anybody who is interested in this work that I'm citing, I'm happy to, if you email me, I'm happy to send a link to my Wisconsin Dropbox or mailbox. But so basically, my uncle, my mother's older brother, Emrullah Agi, died and left an unpublished manuscript, which was an autobiography. And so this was published later in 3 languages. I was the English language editor. And so this discusses the visit of Ayaz Izhaki to Harbin, where my family grew up, part of the merchant diaspora. And so it talks about how earlier Kurbangali had problems at the All Muslim Congress and so on. And so basically that these two were opposing camps. So Izhaki comes to Harbin. I believe he also visited Japan. As I indicated, he was beaten up in Japan. And so these are the kinds of lectures that he was giving. So here we have, in a place like Harbin and Tokyo, somebody who is from Kazan, who lived in Germany, probably visited Poland, may have visited other countries too. I mean, it's tough getting good material on the biography, and I'm sitting here in Bodrum with 2 books and and my PDF collection and online resources, and the books that I have on Ayaz Izhaki are in boxes in a storage facility in Nur Sultan, because I'm donating my library, my personal library, to my department or to the library of Nazarbayev University. But I don't have access to it. So this is the best I can do right now. Okay, so this is my last slide. And so this is about Musa Jarullah Bigi, the dissertation by Selçuk Altuntaş, another one of my PhD students, is a great piece of work. And so look how far we've come to the early 20th century. So this is a picture of Musa Bigi in the 1910s. You see him in pictures dressed like a European dandy. He's a theologian. He's a scholar of the Quran. I think he has a photographic memory, because he said all my books are in my brain. So he must have had a photographic memory and remembered everything he read. He was involved in Muslim congresses. There is one published translation of the Quran attributed to him, but that's in Turkish. He was writing everything of his that I've read is in simplified Ottoman Turkish, the language of Gaspinski perhaps, and there may be somewhere the unpublished version of his own translation of the Quran. He supported himself by writing hundreds of books, and so he had to emigrate and leave his family behind. He would never see them again. He visited Finland, including teaching Islamic courses in Tampere to the Tatar diaspora community there. A few years ago, when I went to the PhD defense of the Imam of Helsinki, who wrote a book on Tatar diaspora in Finland for his PhD defense, I was the opponent. And so I actually went and gave a talk in Tampere and actually met some people who had listened to his lectures or who's had some of his books because they were very young when he was visiting. But so this is a person from the Middle Volga region. I think he's buried in Egypt. He visited Finland. He's also the Arabic teacher for Toshihiko Izutsu, who is a very important Japanese specialist on the Quran.